Good afternoon, and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation Meet the Scientist monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, BBRF's President and CEO. Today, Dr. Kimberly Chiew will present Motivational Modulation of Cognitive Control in ADHD. BBRF is the world's largest private funder of mental health research grants, supporting transformative discoveries in order to develop improved treatments, cures, and methods of prevention. The high quality of the research we fund is made possible by the BBRF Scientific Council. This group of over 190 prominent mental health researchers reviews each grant application and selects the most promising ideas with the greatest potential to lead to breakthroughs. The Scientific Council guides the Foundation to fund creative and impactful basic, translational, and clinical research relevant to the whole spectrum of mental health. One reason that research funded by BBRF has had such great impact is because we do not limit ourselves to one illness or condition. Since 1987, the Foundation has awarded over $450 million to fund more than 6,500 research grants around the world and across a broad spectrum of brain illnesses, including addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, personality disorder, depression, eating disorders, OCD, post-traumatic stress, schizophrenia, as well as suicide prevention. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Kimberly Chiew. Dr. Chiew is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Denver and director of the Motivation, Affect, and Cognition Lab. She was a 2019 independent investigator. Our webinar will begin with Dr. Chiew's presentation, which will then be followed by Q&A. To submit your questions, please use the Questions tab on the control panel on your screen. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time. Following the presentation, I'll ask as many as possible in the time allotted. And now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Chiew. Kimberly, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff, for that introduction, and thank you to everyone for attending. I want to thank the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation for supporting our research, and I'm grateful to be sharing this work with all of you today. So today, I'm going to be sharing work from my laboratory, investigating mechanisms of motivated cognitive control, how those mechanisms develop and how they might be altered in individuals with ADHD, and what that might mean for understanding behavior in this condition. I'll be discussing some of our and others' research investigating motivated cognitive control, both in adults as well as our current work in children. And our aim is to characterize some of the core motivational and cognitive processes that might be altered in ADHD to help inform diagnosis, use of present treatments, as well as development of future treatment strategies. This work is still in relatively early stages, but I'm hopeful that this will advance both improved understanding as well as improved interventions for ADHD. And I'm looking forward to telling you about it. So first, I want to talk briefly about why ADHD might be an important condition for us to understand cognition in. And I'm coming to this work as an experimental cognitive psychologist, and the primary focus of my research program is understanding how emotional and motivational influences might guide cognition and behavior. This relationship, the interplay between motivation and cognition, is important for guiding daily function and behavior. And we can observe changes in motivated cognition in a number of different contexts, as well as changes with age and development and in different mental illnesses. However, ADHD might be particularly interesting and important for us to understand these changes in for a number of reasons. So attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, is a neurodevelopmental difference that's characterized by inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. These symptoms typically arise in early childhood and are estimated to affect up to 11% of school-age children nationally in the United States. For many people, symptoms of ADHD continue into adulthood as well. And so given this pattern, without identification and proper treatment, consequences can include difficulties academically, so in terms of school performance, can include challenges interpersonally with social relationships, as well as difficulties occupationally, so difficulties at work. It's also important to note that over 2/3 of individuals with ADHD have at least one comorbid condition, and this can include different conditions such as oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder in children, as well as anxiety, depression, or learning disorders over the course of the lifespan. And so thinking about these conditions, it really is important to think about the impact that ADHD can have. But I also want to acknowledge and note here that while ADHD symptoms can present challenges in daily life, it's also important to note the strengths and resiliency that individuals with ADHD demonstrate as well. Understanding this relationship and thinking about helping people living better with ADHD really points to the importance of better understanding the core mechanisms that underlie ADHD and its differences, so that we can improve diagnosis, treatment, and ultimately systems that can help people function and live their best lives. So I'm interested in understanding the psychological and neural mechanisms that underlie cognitive control in my research program. And so I'm going to introduce this concept to all of you and then talk about its importance in the context of ADHD. So cognitive control is an umbrella term that refers to the mental processes that allow us to select, implement, and adjust goal-directed behavior. And these processes are sometimes referred to as executive function. We can kind of think of these processes as the building blocks that allow us to plan and carry out behaviors that are important for daily life function. So day to day, we're doing all kinds of different tasks and activities, whether we're doing them at home, at school, at work. Something as mundane as doing a load of laundry, for example, requires us to keep track of a series of behaviors that are necessary for the task and successfully carrying them out. We can think of this kind of process as drawing on cognitive control. Similarly, when we're planning out what we need to do at school or what we need to do in the workplace, we can think about cognitive control processes as the building blocks that make planning and carrying out those activities possible. In scientific research, we can assess cognitive control performance using different laboratory measures and tasks. And we can think about performance on these measures as importantly associated with people's academic, social, and occupational life outcomes in day-to-day life. So what these relationships indicate is that cognitive control is an important construct for understanding people's daily life function and their behavior psychologically. Additionally, we can think about cognitive control as being associated with brain activity. This happens across a number of different brain areas, but in particular, the prefrontal cortex, in this diagram highlighted in blue, seems to be particularly important for cognitive control processes. And so extensive evidence from both psychology and neuroscience research indicates that the prefrontal cortex might be key for supporting successful cognitive control performance. Additionally, we can think of both the prefrontal cortex and cognitive control as developing over the course of adulthood. So this is just a schematic here to illustrate this relationship. The prefrontal cortex takes a relatively long time to fully mature, and so we can think about this maturation process happening over the course of childhood and adolescence and kind of reaching full maturity in young adulthood. So this is a process that takes place over a number of years. Along with this maturation in the prefrontal cortex, we can think about cognitive control performance as also improving over the course of childhood and adolescence before reaching a plateau in young adulthood, before changes at the older end of the lifespan. So I just am introducing this so that we can keep in mind that over the course of childhood and the period when ADHD symptoms are often emerging for individuals, we can think about those as well as cognitive control performance as occurring in the context of this slow maturation process. Cognitive control processes, importantly, seem to change in ADHD. And in particular, decreased inhibition, a key element of cognitive control, has been argued to potentially be the core feature of ADHD. Inhibition refers to the mind's ability to tune out stimuli that might be irrelevant to the current task or situation, as well as the ability to withhold actions that might be irrelevant or inappropriate. So sort of stopping yourself from carrying out a given action. This also draws on inhibition. While extensive work suggests that changes in inhibition might occur in ADHD, it's also important to note that these changes have been inconsistent across different individuals, as well as across different studies. And this suggests that we need more nuanced measures of cognitive control, as well as better accounting for contextual or situational factors in order to potentially really understand how cognition and behavior can change. Recognizing this has led to consideration of additional factors in ADHD and how they might shape performance, including reward and reinforcement motivational processes. So rewarding outcomes can come in many forms. Day to day, we're doing all kinds of different behaviors and actions in the pursuit of rewards, whether they're direct or indirect. These can include things such as prizes or payoffs. They can include desirable outcomes at school or at work. This can also include social rewards. So this might include social approval, as well as rewarding social relationship interactions. It can even include primary rewards, such as foods and beverages as well. We can think of rewards as important influences that are guiding and reinforcing behavior. And so by reinforce, we can think of an action that leads to a reward as being more likely to happen again or to be repeated. So we can think of it as being subject to reinforcement. Additionally, neuroscience studies indicate that the brain's responses to rewards are associated with activity in the dopamine neurotransmitter system. And this transmitter originates in the midbrain, this area kind of down low on the diagram here, and it travels down a number of pathways that are projecting through the brain and bringing the neurotransmitter dopamine to several areas that are critical for cognition. Importantly, these include the prefrontal cortex, which is labeled here on the diagram and which I mentioned earlier as important to cognitive control. We can also think of dopamine as implicated in ADHD, given the fact that stimulant medications, which are effective treatments for many, but not all individuals with ADHD, alter activity in this symptom and seem to help many people. So there's evidence, along with evidence that cognitive control processes might be changed in ADHD, there's also increasing recognition that reward and reinforcement processes might also be altered. And evidence investigating motivational processes in ADHD has shown that people with ADHD are more likely to choose smaller immediate rewards over larger future payoffs. They also show less learning from reinforcement than individuals without ADHD. Dovetailing with this behavioral evidence, neuroscience studies have suggested that activity in the dopamine neurotransmitter system might be altered in ADHD. This relates to what I just mentioned. Stimulant medication changing activity in the dopamine system is helpful to many individuals with ADHD, suggesting a role for dopamine. However, similar to studies investigating cognitive control in ADHD, evidence has been inconsistent in terms of what aspects of reward response and dopamine function might be altered. So to help address these inconsistencies and move towards a better understanding of mechanisms underlying behavior in ADHD, more nuanced models of motivation and cognitive control are required. In our research on cognitive control, we've developed and used a theoretical model of cognitive control known as the dual mechanisms of control framework. And this framework suggests that cognitive control can operate via a balance between two different modes, which we call proactive control and reactive control. The proactive control approach is characterized by the use of sustained preparatory task information maintained over time. And so I'm going to use a real life example to illustrate this. Suppose we have a real life goal to carry out, such as driving from one destination to another in a car. We can imagine using proactive control to prepare for this task, planning out our route, holding information in mind as we're carrying out the task. However, as we're driving along, there might be unexpected events that occur, such as wildlife in the road. We could think of this as an occasion where we might need reactive control, flexibly implemented at critical periods, and helping us respond effectively to sudden indicators in the environment in order to continue carrying out our goal-directed behavior effectively. We can also think of these two different modes of control as happening at different timescales. So proactive control is typically thought to occur relatively early in a preparatory fashion and be sustained as people are carrying out a goal-directed behavior, whereas reactive control is happening relatively late or in a transient fashion. So it's just emerging when it's needed. And so we can think about variability in cognitive control performance as a balance between these two different modes of control. And this framework has been quite useful for us and other scientists in characterizing differences in controlled performance across a number of different comparisons. This has included differences in cognitive control with age, with mental health symptoms, with individual differences such as personality variables, as well as differences with different situational factors. And so we worked within this framework to try to understand better changes in cognitive control that can happen with motivational incentive and with ADHD. So, first, I want to show you some foundational work that we've conducted investigating how rewards are associated with changes in the relative use of proactive and reactive control. And this work is done in young adults without ADHD. In this work, we used a cognitive paradigm known as the AX Continuous Performance Task, or AXCBT, which has been widely used to characterize separate metrics of proactive and reactive control under different situational contexts and in different population groups. This is something called a Chiew probe task. It's done on a computer by participants, and on each trial, people are seeing a cue followed by a probe, and they're instructed that they need to make a button press response to the cue probe combination. In this line of work, we had a precursor letting people know whether on this trial they were going to be doing the task for a reward or not. And this was followed by a cue and then a probe, and people needed to make a button press. And so in this version of the task, the cue and the probe were alphabet letters. The rewards that we were using in this experiment were money bonuses, which are commonly used as an experimental manipulation of motivation in cognitive psychology studies. So the way that the AXCBT works is that participants were instructed every time you see an A cue, the letter A, followed by an X probe, you need to press button 1. And if you see any other combination of cue and probe, you need to press button 2. In the classic version of the paradigm, which we used in this task, the AX combination occurred at a high frequency, 70%, which creates a strong association between the AQ and that button press number 1, as well as between the X probe and that same button press. And these associations allow us to examine relative tendencies towards proactive and reactive control by looking at profiles of performance in two other trial types. The first of these has the same cue once again, the letter A, but it's followed by a different probe, for example, the letter Y, and these are called AY trials. The correct response on this trial is button number 2. However, the more that people are preparing and the more that they're using proactive control, the more they might be expecting to press button 1 and the more difficulty they might have on this particular trial type. So we can think about a higher rate of errors or slower performance on these AY trials as being indicative of higher proactive control. We can also look at a profile of performance in a third trial type where there's a different cue, for example, the letter B, but it's followed by that high frequency letter X probe once again. The correct response to this combination is button number 2, but if people are heavily using reactive control, we can think about the X, that high frequency stimulus that's associated with button press number 1 as having to be overcome. They might be a little bit slower or making errors. And so here, worse performance on this particular trial is thought to be indicative of higher reactive control. We also have BY trials, which have neither an A nor an X. The correct response to these is button 2, and these are acting as a low frequency control condition. And so the power of this particular task paradigm is in its ability to allow us to estimate separately use of proactive and reactive control across different contexts, as well as across different individuals or population groups. Additionally, we used rewards in combination with this task. So we looked at task performance under a baseline condition where there were no rewards at stake. And then we had people do a second condition where they were told some of the trials you'll have the potential of earning a reward. There are some where there was no rewards, which we called just reward prospect. And then there are some where there's direct incentivization, which we called reward incentive trials. And so this allows us to really pinpoint the timing of reward effects and how they shape performance. Additionally, we were looking at task performance on this paradigm together with a measure from an eye tracking camera, which allowed us to measure the pupil of the eye as people were performing the task. And so in this photograph here, you can see an example of our eye tracking setup. So we have a participant who's looking at the task on a computer screen while their eye is being recorded, and there's a chin rest here to help minimize head motion and to keep the head nice and still for measurement. The reason that we are collecting this data is because there's a remarkable characteristic of our eyes. It seems that pupil diameter actually gets larger as people are concentrating on a task or using more effortful cognitive control. And so really importantly here, this change in pupil diameter seems to be separate from changes in the pupil that can happen with brightness or luminance. And what this characteristic means is that monitoring changes in pupil diameter using eye tracking relative to task performance can provide us with a lot of information about the amount of cognitive control that's used, as well as its timing. And so looking at that timing of cognitive control is important to the dual mechanisms framework, which argues that proactive control should manifest relatively early. It should be happening in a preparatory fashion, while reactive control should manifest later, right when action is needed. So this allows us a separate measure that really helps us get at the nuance of cognitive control and how it might change with reward motivators. Okay, so I want to show you some results from our study looking at reward motivated AX-CBT performance in young adults. And so the first information that I'm showing here is looking at how fast people are responding. So we're looking at their reaction times. And so on the graph here, we're looking at them across the 4 different trial types in the task, which I introduced, and we're looking at them in relation to our different motivation manipulations. So looking at differences from baseline to reward prospect to reward incentive. What we see here is that in general, AY trials are the slowest trial type. They've got the highest reaction times, which is pretty typical in young adults. But additionally, we see that there are differences across all 4 trial types relating to the reward motivation. So people are slowest in the baseline condition. They're getting faster, their reaction times are lower in the reward prospect trials, and then there's a second speeding up in reward incentive trials. This pattern here makes a lot of sense given the task. One thing I didn't know previously is that people were instructed that they could earn a reward based on fast and accurate performance. So there was a deadline. And so it makes a lot of sense here that people are going faster, which potentially requires cognitive control in order to try to earn reward bonuses. However, when we look at task performance in terms of errors as well as reaction times, the pattern gets a little bit more nuanced than just looking at reaction times alone. This second graph is looking at the pattern of error rates across our different trials and across our different reward conditions. And the first thing I want to highlight is that in AX trials, BX, and BY trials, errors are pretty low and they're actually decreasing from baseline to reward prospect to reward incentive conditions. However, along with this pattern, there's a big difference that we can observe in AY trials. We see that there are higher errors in AY trials to begin with, and then there's a continuing increase in these errors. People are doing worse on these trials as they transition from baseline to reward prospect to reward incentive. And so given, as I noted, that worse performance on these trials can be thought of as indicating increased proactive control, we can see that this pattern, combined with faster and more accurate performance in all other trial types of the task, indicates that reward is increasing use of proactive cognitive control. When we think about this pattern of task performance in combination with the pupil dilation data, we have further support for this account. So this time course graph here is showing us pupil dilation over time during the trial, and this is during the reward prospect block. So we can see reward prospect trials where there's not directly a reward at stake in the dotted lines, and then we can see reward incentive trials in the solid lines with different colors for our 4 different trial types. And so as we look at this graph and we think about change in pupil dilation over the course of the trial, the first thing that I want to highlight here is that pupil dilation is larger, it's higher in the reward incentive trials compared to the ones where there is not a reward incentive at stake. And so we can think of this as indicating that there's greater use of effortful cognitive control with reward. However, I also want to highlight the timing at which these different time courses are pulling apart from each other. What we can see here is that the solid time courses are pulling apart from the dotted ones relatively early, even before the probe is coming on the screen and people need to make a button press. If we actually look at this period just before the probe appears on the screen, so this is between the cue and the probe, there's a statistically significant difference in average pupil dilation between the reward incentive trials and the reward prospect. And so this is important because it suggests that the use of increased cognitive control with incentive is emerging in a preparatory or a proactive fashion, consistent with the pattern we see in behavior. What this is showing us together is that cognitive performance behaviorally, as well as pupil dilation, are converging in suggesting that reward motivation can be associated specifically with increased proactive control. And additional work from outside our lab has shown, using neuroimaging, that reward can be associated with sustained brain activity in the prefrontal cortex, as well as other cognitive control related areas, consistent with the idea that reward is specifically improving proactive control. Importantly, this work looked at these patterns in the brain over the course of child development. So they looked at it in a group of children, a group of adolescents, as well as a young adult group. And they saw that over the course of development, there's this increase in activity in these control-related brain areas that's happening proactively with reward. And so this is important because while cognitive control in general is improving over the course of childhood and adolescence to adulthood, it seems like within each age group, reward is improving proactive control in a similar fashion. So this takes us to our current ongoing study, which is supported by BBRF, where we were interested in looking at reward motivation and how it might change the use of proactive and reactive control in children who are varying in ADHD symptomology, using both task performance in an AXCBD paradigm, as well as measures of pupillometry. And so in this work, our participants are children ages 8 to 16 who are varying in ADHD symptomology. So this work is still ongoing. We are including individuals who meet criteria for comorbid learning differences, anxiety, and depression. As I noted previously, these comorbidity rates are very high in ADHD. However, we excluded children with a history of brain injury or trauma, history of seizure, or a current diagnosis of other neurological or genetic conditions. We asked our participants if they were on medication to withhold use of stimulant medication for 24 hours prior to participation to try to pinpoint cognitive changes that might be happening in relationship to ADHD symptoms. And we recruited our participants from an NIH-funded study examining cognitive risk factors and comorbidity between ADHD and learning disabilities. This is work that has been a partnership between the University of Colorado as well as University of Denver and other institutions, and that's been ongoing in Colorado for a number of decades. We are recruiting kids who most recently participated in the study who fit within our age range, and we also recruited more broadly from the Metro Denver community. So we characterize our participants using a number of different measures. We obtained demographic information from our participants. We measured ADHD symptom levels using the strengths and weaknesses of ADHD and normal behavior scale. We used the child behavior checklist to characterize general behavior as well as psychopathology symptoms. And given evidence that individuals who are higher in incentive sensitivity might have a larger response to these kinds of incentives when they're presented in the context of a cognitive task, we had a measure of reward and punishment sensitivity so that we could characterize individual variability in that measure as well. Given the age group that we were working with, we used an age-adapted version of the AXCBT, which really similarly to our young adult work was presented in a baseline condition with reward prospect and reward incentives. So similar to that work, we had a precursor that let people know whether on a given trial they were going to be doing it for a reward or not. We once again used money bonuses in this experiment. And then we had people look at a Chiew followed by a probe following a short delay. And so to make this kind of kid-friendly, we used images of farm animals instead of alphabet letters, try to make it a little bit more interesting. And the instructions here for the kids were, if you see a pig followed by a cow, please press button 1. And if you see any other combination of animals, press button 2. After children made their response, They received feedback, letting them know whether they were correct or not, and then on reward trials, whether they had successfully earned a bonus or not. We once again used monetary bonuses, and then there was a pause before the next trial. This task was carried out similarly to our adult study, while eye tracking was done over the course of the task. And so, as I noted, we are continuing data collection in the study now, but I want to show you some preliminary results. And so this is from a preliminary sample of 48 children across our full range of participation, but a little bit on the older side. So the average participant in this data I'm going to show you today is about 13 years of age. We had about 11 participants who demonstrated clinically significant ADHD symptoms and/or who reported a formal ADHD diagnosis. And of those individuals, approximately half of them reported a comorbid diagnosis as well. So taking a look at our data, there was a number of things on the basis of prior evidence from the scientific literature that we were interested in testing for. And so the first was within this range that we were looking at different ages of the children, whether there would be changes in cognitive control. As I noted previously, cognitive control continues to develop over the course of childhood and adolescence, and these seems to happen hand in hand with maturation in the prefrontal cortex. And so when we looked at differences in overall performance in the AXCBT task over the course of age, we saw a significant decrease in errors as our participants got older. And so this is indicating that over the course of, as the kids are getting older, they're being more accurate on the task. We also looked at reaction times, and we saw numerically, but not statistically significant, there's a speeding effect where reaction times are also getting faster in the task. What this is showing us is that our data is replicating an extensive body of prior evidence suggesting that cognitive control is improving and developing over the course of childhood and adolescence. So this was an important check for us to do just to see if there are differences in cognitive control with age within the range that we were examining in this study. Next, we were interested in looking at, again in our overall sample, whether there were reward-related changes in cognitive control and the extent to which they might be similar to what we had observed in young adults, where we saw an improvement in performance overall, but specifically an increase in proactive cognitive control. So just like in our young adult study, when there was a reward at stake, kids could earn it on the basis of accurate and fast performance. And so when we look at the reaction times over our 4 different trial types in the paradigm and across our 3 reward conditions, we see a pattern that's very similar to what we had observed in young adults. So once again, we see that there are differences relating to trial type where people are slowest, they have the highest reaction times in the AY trials, and we see that there's a significant speeding. They're getting faster from the baseline condition to reward prospect to reward incentive. So this so far is very similar to what we've seen in our prior data. When we look at this in combination with the error rates, we see that error rates, once again, in the AX, BX, and BY trials are relatively low, and they're staying stable or they're actually decreasing from baseline to reward prospect to reward incentive. So in those 3 trial types, people are getting both faster and they're becoming more accurate. But just like in our young adult data, we see a different pattern in the AY trials. The error rate here is higher, and it continues to increase from baseline to reward prospect to reward incentive. And so this pattern here, we can consider it a replication of our initial results in young adults. This shows us that reward might be increasing proactive control in youth that are varying in ADHD symptomology as well. When we dug a little bit deeper into this preliminary data and looked at the relationship between ADHD symptoms and motivated cognitive control, there were subtle differences that we saw. So I want to note here that for these analyses, we were looking at ADHD symptoms using the SWAN measure. So we're looking at them on a continuum instead of splitting our group into ADHD and non-ADHD groups. And we examined these measures using regression analyses where we controlled for both age and sex of our participants. So on a number of different outcomes, we saw that performance on the task did not significantly differ with ADHD symptom levels. So there was not a significant relationship between these symptom levels and overall performance on the task in terms of how accurate people were, as well as how fast that they were responding, as well as no difference in terms of the balance between proactive and reactive control. Importantly, we also did not see a difference with ADHD symptoms in the extent to which the balance between proactive and reactive control change with reward. So you could think about across the spectrum of ADHD symptom levels that we had in our preliminary sample, we saw there was consistent increase in proactive control with reward. The one characteristic that we pinpointed as differing significantly with ADHD symptom levels was reward-related response speeding. So this is a little bit different than their cognitive control. This is just looking at how fast they are across the board. While people in general got faster when rewards were at stake, it seemed like individuals with higher ADHD symptom levels actually had a greater pattern of reward-related speeding. So there's a suggestion here that there might be some differences in cognitive performance, but also that they're manifesting in a relatively subtle fashion. We have started to take a look at our pupil data, and so this is really a sneak peek that I'm sharing with all of you of our pupil time courses. This is similar to the young adult data that I showed you, where we're looking at the differences in the reward block, where the dotted time courses are reward prospect trials. They're not directly incentivized, and compared to in the solid lines, reward incentive trials, where people have the possibility of earning a reward. And so for now, this is split into our group who had clinically significant symptoms or a formal diagnosis of ADHD compared to those who do not. We haven't conducted analyses yet on this data, so this is really a first look, but just by taking a look at the pattern here of pupil dilation, we can see some aspects that are quite similar to what we observed in young adults, where pupil dilation is higher in the reward incentive trials compared to those that were not. So this is again dovetailing with our behavioral data, suggesting that people are using a higher level of cognitive control. There's also a tantalizing possibility here that our group with ADHD are, their time courses are on average higher, suggesting that they might be using more cognitive effort, they might be using more cognitive control, but without having a full sample and formal analyses, this is still very tentative. So we're continuing to take a look into this data and probe it further to really understand the relationship here. So this work is still in progress, but what these preliminary findings are showing us is that our sample of children and youth with varying in ADHD symptomology display similar age and reward-related differences in cognitive control compared to samples in the prior scientific literature. It also seems like the differences in task performance in relation to ADHD symptoms are relatively subtle. But the one thing that we did note is that there was a relationship there between ADHD symptom levels and reward-related speeding, where kids with higher symptom levels seem to get faster in response to reward compared to kids with lower levels of symptoms. And again, our work using pupilometric data is continuing, But this data, we believe that this method's approach holds promise as a measure of cognitive effort and getting at its nuance in relation to reward context, as well as in relation to individual differences in ADHD symptoms. So I want to talk a little bit about the implications of this work and how we hope it might have impact in terms of improving the lives of individuals with ADHD. So as noted, the scientific literature has had it's been difficult to characterize the differences in cognitive control as well as in motivational processes that can happen in ADHD. There's been inconsistencies across different studies. There's a suggestion that there might be some subtleties here and important for us to get at more nuance in the way that we characterize these outcomes. And so our hope here is that our approach characterizing the effects of reward on proactive and reactive cognitive control might help us both better understand as well as better customize behavioral management of ADHD. So there are a number of different behavioral strategies that individuals with ADHD can use. Understanding how these strategies can work can maybe help us customize and optimize them. So one common behavioral management strategy is the use of checklists, sticker charts, supports that can help people with ADHD plan out what they need to do and successfully carry out those different tasks. We can think about successful use of this kind of checklist or sticker chart system as potentially drawing on these different modes of cognitive control. So we could think about planning what to do as potentially requiring proactive control. And then as different tasks are successfully completed and rewards such as stickers or other reinforcements are provided, we can think about that kind of reinforcing feedback as potentially eliciting reactive control, helping people adjust their behavior and making it more likely that they're going to continue to carry out those tasks and receive those rewards in the future. Relating these kinds of aspects of behavioral management to different control modes might help us understand how they're effective and how to customize them to become even more effective for individuals varying in ADHD symptoms. This brings me to an important point. It's important to keep in mind that ADHD presents differently in different people. And so our hope is that our scientific approach, where we're able to look at this nuance and characterize differences between proactive and reactive control, might help us understand underlying mechanisms and how to understand and address this variability most effectively in different interventions. It might help us customize and optimize both the format and the timing of behavioral supports and reward reinforcement. One of the things that I think is really important about this model that we're working within is that it really emphasizes the idea that the timing of control can differ, and then the timing of different rewards and reinforcements might be important. And so if we take into account this dimension, this might have potential for helping us build behavioral supports and reinforcements that work optimally for different individuals with ADHD. We also know that reward and cognition outcomes that we're studying using this kind of approach are drawing on activity in the dopamine neurotransmitter system and brain areas such as the prefrontal cortex. And so moving forward, we think it'll be important to combine our scientific approach with additional biological and brain activity measures to better improve understanding of dopamine differences in ADHD, their relationship to behavior, and how to address them. Ultimately, we hope that better understanding of these differences will also help us build more supportive systems for people who are varying in ADHD symptoms as well. So taken together, The work that I've shown you today is continuing and is still relatively early, but we're really excited about this approach. And so we believe that the dual mechanisms of control framework is a promising approach for better understanding cognitive control in ADHD. Our approach really highlights the importance of considering the timing of both cognitive control as well as motivational processes. And our use of pupillometry allows us a window into this timing with greater precision than just looking at task behavior alone. And ultimately, it's our hope to advance understanding of the mechanisms that are underlying ADHD and improve treatment and management approaches to help people with ADHD moving forward. So that is the end of my presentation today. I have a lot of thanks and gratitude for first the individuals and families that are participating in our research. Thank you to my lab, the University of Denver Motivation, Affect, and Cognition Lab, highlighted in red here, collaborators and our partners at University of Colorado Boulder. And I want to thank the funders of our research, and in particular, the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, who have helped make this work possible. Thank you.
Kimberly, thank you for the work you're doing and for an outstanding presentation. And I love, number one, that you're sharing with us hot off the press ongoing work. So we're sort of seeing the preliminary information, and it shows how science works, and that you develop some information, and more obviously needs to come forward. And I love how you make that connection between the research and what can potentially be very helpful to people clinically. And one question is, even with the preliminary data that you have and the implications that you shared with us, what can a family do right now if they have a child, a teenager with ADHD? What steps can be taken in the here and now with what we know, based upon prior information and the early results of the research? What can families do to help their child?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jeff. I think that one of the important perspectives that our work is illustrating, and that prior work looking at cognition and ADHD is also indicating, is that I think it's important to, the evidence, it's important to keep in mind that it's showing that individuals with ADHD don't necessarily have, they're able to use cognitive control, but there might just be some differences in their ability to sort of mobilize it towards different tasks and different goals that they need to carry out. So I think a number of different families of people with ADHD can tell you, anecdotally, there's a phenomenon called hyperfocus in ADHD where kids with ADHD might have difficulty paying attention to some things, but then they might be really able to dig into and pay attention to other things that they find engaging. And so I think our work here is part of a body of work showing it's not necessarily just that cognition is, it's not necessarily that cognition has a fundamental difference, but maybe it's the way that we mobilize it. And so I think, again, experimenting with different behavioral management strategies, keeping in mind that people are different, keeping in mind that the profile of ADHD symptoms are different, trying to figure out what kinds of motivators might be really helpful for someone to keep on track and what kind of format might be most helpful. It's our goal to help, develop evidence-based approaches for kind of calibrating that. But in the meantime, sort of recognizing that it's not necessarily that cognition itself is fundamentally poorer in ADHD, but instead it seems like there's some challenges in mobilizing it. That's a really important and subtle difference that I think is powerful to keep in mind and allows sort of approach, how do we figure out how to help people stay on task optimally? I think that's something important.
Absolutely, absolutely, extremely important, and makes a difference in people's lives. I'd like to speak a little bit about the findings about improvement with age, because I think this is also important and very hopeful for individuals, for families to know that with age there could be improvement that occurs.
Yes, definitely. So looking at changes in the prefrontal cortex and in other brain areas, as well as development and changes in cognitive performance that can happen hand in hand with those brain changes, is something that we see really robustly in kids, broadly, with and without ADHD symptoms. It definitely seems like the ability to concentrate and to use cognitive control effectively is something that continues to develop and continues to improve over the course of childhood and adolescence heading towards young adulthood. It also, in the early slide that I had introducing ADHD, I note, while ADHD symptoms often emerge in early adulthood, there are some individuals who continue to have ADHD symptoms as they mature into adulthood, but not everyone does. So I think that this, it's currently not clear what might predict one person continuing to have ADHD symptoms into adulthood and another not. But I think that that trajectory of change in the context of developmental processes that are happening in childhood and adulthood are really important. It seems like as kids get older, the brain maturing is potentially positioning them to be better at doing carrying out cognitive control, carrying out these kinds of different performance tasks and daily life function. And so I think that that is a trajectory that is important to keep in mind, that happens in a relatively universal fashion.
Good, thank you, thank you. One last question. If you could envision where your work will be in 5 years from now, 10 years from now, what would you envision? What do you see?
That's a great question, Jeff. So I'm very interested in kind of getting at the nuts and bolts of these kinds of motivation cognition interactions. And there's a lot of different dimensions to that relationship, both when we're characterizing it in terms of behavior as well as when we're characterizing it in the brain. And so as you can kind of see as a thread throughout the talk, I'm very interested in timing. And I think that there's a lot of subtleties to timing of brain processes that we can kind of tease apart using different cognitive and behavioral experiments that really help us get at a more fine-grained and a more nuanced understanding of how this fundamental relationship between motivation and cognition plays out. I do think, especially with the amount of inconsistency and kind of a little bit of mystery that there is in trying to understand how these processes change in ADHD, that kind of nuance and timing is going to be important in really getting a comprehensive understanding of how cognition changes in this disorder. And so my hope is that this will allow us thinking about these different parameters of variation will be important to getting more tailored and more effective interventions, whether that's behavioral or medication related interventions, to ultimately help people with ADHD and other conditions in an optimized fashion.
Well, thank you. I so very much appreciate your presentation and the work that you do, and look forward to getting further updates from you moving forward. So, Kimberly, thank you so very, very much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share my work today.
Great, thanks. I also want to thank everybody who joined us today. I'd ask you to please consider making a donation to BBRF today. 100% of every dollar donated for research is invested in our research grants. We're able to do this because our operating expenses are covered by separate foundation grants. This means that when you donate $1 for research, that dollar goes directly to the scientist. To make a donation, please visit our website, bbrfoundation.org, or call us at 1-800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you missed any portion of the presentation or would like to share it, please visit the events and webinar page on our website. Also, please join us again on August 13th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, when Dr. Laura Berner, an assistant professor of psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, will present Timing is Everything. Repeated neurocognitive assessments can help us understand symptom patterns in bulimia nervosa. Thank you, and remember, together we can dramatically improve the lives of those living with mental illness and enable more people to live full, happy, and productive lives. Take care.